The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 4th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The Gospel of the Lord. So today's Gospel reading begins as Jesus and his disciples get into a boat and start to cross over the Sea of Galilee. On both of my trips to Israel, I also have had the opportunity to get into a boat, although a much larger boat than Jesus and the disciples would have been in, and to travel out on the Sea of Galilee as well. Now, at first glance, it doesn't seem like this would be a very perilous adventure to go out on the Sea of Galilee, because after all, they let tourists do it. But what we call a sea is really just a lake. It's a very large lake. It's about 13 miles long. It's about 8 miles wide at its largest point. Unless it's really foggy, you can always see the other side of the lake, which is why in other stories people see Jesus and his disciples traveling someplace on the boat, and they run around the lake shore and they get to the place where Jesus is before the boat docks, because it's easy to figure out where the boat's going and to get there. So it doesn't seem like, most of the time, this would be a big problem, and often it's not. But the Sea of Galilee has a couple of geographic features that make it a little bit dangerous. First of all, it is surrounded completely by mountains, but there's a cut in the northern part of the mountains that funnels winds down on it, like kind of a wind tunnel. And so these violent windstorms can come up pretty much any time and in unexpected moments. The other thing is that the Sea of Galilee itself is about 200 meters below sea level. And up near with the northern cut, where the winds are coming from, about 20 miles north of that, are mountains high enough that it snows in the mountains. So the temperature difference is really great. So when these winds come down, they can be very violent, and they can also end up, because of the temperature difference, producing thunderstorms that make ours look really kind of mild by comparison. So it is possible to get out on the lake and have it be absolute dead calm. The first time I was on it, the sea was as ripply as this carpet is. It was absolutely calm like that. There were a couple other times when I was there where I thought, well, it looks a little choppy, but probably not too bad, and that is because I have never personally served in the Navy, but there were a couple of guys in our group that had, and they go, "We're not going out in that." It can change really quickly. So going out on the lake can be really dangerous, and in Jesus' day, it was no different. And Jesus' disciples, many of them, were fishermen. They knew that these storms could come up. They had been in these storms before, and frankly, they knew what to do when they got caught in one of these giant windstorms. Yet sometimes I think we read this story, and we think that the disciples were somehow shocked and amazed that there was a storm upon them. It's like, oh my gosh, there's a storm. We've never seen anything like this. Well, sure they have, lots of times. They're used to these kinds of storms being out there on the lake. Or we think, well, maybe they were just panicking. It was so bad they didn't know what to do, and they're waking Jesus up because they're like, "Jesus, you have to do a miracle. We don't know what to do." But in fact, they knew what was happening, and they knew what they needed to do. What bothers them is not the windstorm, but that Jesus is seemingly able to sleep through it all. They wonder how Jesus could be so oblivious and so seemingly disconnected to the crisis of the moment. And so they wake Jesus up and they say, "Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing? Don't you care?" Now, I think it's a mistake to read this question as a cry of desperation that they need or expect Jesus to perform some kind of miracle. they clearly do not expect that at all. What they want is simply for Jesus to wake up, pay attention, and help them bail out the boat. Because they know that if everybody bails, eventually the storm will die down, they'll keep the water out of the boat, and they'll probably be fine. They know that if they do this, it'll work. And this is an all-hands-on-deck struggle, however, and Jesus is seemingly absent from the struggle. And that's the storm that really bothers the disciples. They can basically handle the wind and the waves. They've dealt with that before, but the storm inside of them is the storm that wonders, does Jesus notice? Does Jesus care? Is he going to do anything to help us out in the midst of this mess that we find ourselves in? See, that was the storm that Jesus really was interested in calming. We sometimes focus on how Jesus rebuked the wind and the waves and everything suddenly got calm in the weather outside. But the disciples, I don't think they really expected Jesus to do that. They just wanted him to wake up and help bail. And so when Jesus calms the storm, they are absolutely dumbstruck. They hadn't expected that at all. And then Jesus goes on and he asks them about their faith. Why are you afraid? Because after all, the storm's over outside. Why are you still afraid? That is, why is the storm still going on in your hearts and your minds? Because after all, faith is not the belief that if you have Jesus with you in the boat of your life, nothing bad will happen to you, or that suddenly Jesus will make the storm go away. If they'd expected that, they wouldn't have been so dumbstruck. Instead, the kind of faith that Jesus wanted the disciples to have, the kind of faith that would at least partially calm the storm in their hearts and in their minds, was the confidence that they were never alone and abandoned in their storm, even if it seemed like Jesus was sleeping at the moment. It was the kind of confidence that they would know that Jesus really did care about them, even if he was not reacting in the ways that they expected him to react. Faith was the kind of confidence to know that Jesus really was going to help them, even if in the end that help came in really unexpected ways. What Jesus wanted his first disciples to learn from this experience was not that no storm would ever happen to them if he was with them. Clearly it did. And Jesus also wasn't promising to miraculously stop the storms in their lives if they screamed loud enough, because it only happened this one time. It was so unique that they wrote it down because it only happened that one time. Instead, what Jesus wanted his disciples to learn and appreciate, and what Jesus wants all of us to know and appreciate, is that even when storms appear in our lives, Jesus really is with us and aware of what's going on, even when it seems as though he's sleeping through the chaos of our lives. Because, I know sometimes when I go through a crisis and I see things happening around me, and I wonder, does anybody notice? And if I think nobody notices, maybe God doesn't notice, it makes me crazy. I'm always crazy. But it makes me crazier if I think nobody's there. We have an expression that's popular in culture right now about being woke. Being woke means that you're really in touch with what's happening and what's really important and what's, Jesus literally ain't woke in this story. He is asleep on the cushion, and they think he doesn't notice. He doesn't even have an awareness of the storm that's going on. But they learned that Jesus actually did know what was happening, and that they were not alone in that storm. And that's what Jesus wants us to know, no matter what kind of storm we're going through in our lives also. Jesus wanted the disciples and us to always know that no matter what storm we're experiencing in our lives, Jesus does care, even if he isn't reacting in ways that we want him to. Because it's sometimes easy to feel that if somebody is not reacting with the kind of energy that I would expect somebody to react in the crisis that I'm going through, that somehow they don't really care about this. That they don't care about what I'm going through or what the world is going through. I have a number of friends on Facebook, and if you've got Facebook, you may have these friends also, who are constantly posting outrage of, the next crisis or outrageous thing that happens in the world, and there's lots of them lately. It's like, you gotta wake up and think about this, and boom. And it's like, if you're not posting about this stuff all the time, you don't really care. It's like, yeah, I do really care, even if I'm not constantly filling my social media feeds with all of this stuff. But sometimes people feel like if you're not reacting to these things, as Jesus was not hopping up and going, let's bail, let's bail, let's bail, that somehow or other, he didn't care. What the disciples learned, and what Jesus wants us always to know, is that Jesus really does care about what we're going through, even if he isn't doing the things that we would think we should be doing if we were in the middle of that. And what Jesus wanted his disciples to know, what he wants all of us to know too, is that Jesus really will help us, even if the way that Jesus ends up helping us is in ways that we did not expect, or even in ways that we can't really truly kind of perceive until we can look in retrospect. And it's been that way sometimes in my life, where I've been going through something really bad, and I've kept screaming at God to, like, end the storm, stop the storm, make the storm go away. And finally, when the storm calms down in and of itself, kind of like that storm eventually would have anyway, out on the boat, I can look back and say, you know, God was giving me strength to get through that storm. He was giving me people and events and opportunities that really did give me strength to get through the storm, but I couldn't see it at the time, only in retrospect. That was kind of what the disciples had also, where they kept wondering and wanting Jesus to actually get involved in the bailing operation, and then they were dumbstruck when he stopped the storm, and afterwards they could look back on it and go, you know what? Jesus is going to help us in our storms, one way or the other. We don't know exactly how. It may happen in unexpected ways. It may happen through unexpected people. It may happen in ways that we only see later on in retrospect. But we know Jesus is going to help us. That's what Jesus wants us to know as well. The windstorm that the disciples faced that day on the lake certainly was not the first storm they'd encountered in their lives, and it was not going to be the last. But in the midst of that particular storm, they realized that Jesus really did know what was going on, even if he seemed just to be sleeping. They realized Jesus cared about him, even if he was not up frantically bailing the boat. And they found out that Jesus really would help them, even if that help came in unexpected ways. And the knowledge and the confidence that they got through that helped calm the storm in their hearts and their minds. It helped them to endure the next storm and the storm after that. And it's that knowledge and that confidence and that peace that Jesus wants to give each of us every day, no matter what kind of storm